For more than 30 years, it sat under a rusted metal cap in the frozen north of Russia, welded shut, bolted down, and quietly forgotten. From the surface, it looks like nothing. A heavy iron lid, roughly the size of a manhole cover, half buried in the snow and surrounded by the crumbling ruins of an abandoned research station. You could walk right past it and never know what you were standing on. But directly beneath that little metal cap is the deepest hole human beings have ever drilled into the planet. Not the deepest mine, not the deepest cave, the deepest artificial point on Earth. It goes down more than 12 kilometers, deeper than the height of Mount Everest turned upside down and buried in the ground, deeper than any drill has ever gone before or since. And when scientists finally went back, reopened the sealed records, pulled the old core samples out of storage, and re-examined what that hole actually brought up from the darkness, the findings didn't just surprise people. They rewrote parts of what we thought we knew about the ground beneath our feet. Water that had no business being where they found it. Living things, kilometers down, in rock that should have been dead and empty. A boundary predicted by every textbook that simply wasn't there when they reached it. And of course, the recording. The one that supposedly captured the sound of millions of human voices screaming from somewhere far below the surface. The one that made people call this place the well to hell. Now, most of what you've heard about this hole is a lie. I'll tell you that up front, because I'm not going to waste your time pretending otherwise. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. Once you strip away the lies, what's actually left, the real, documented, verifiable discoveries that came out of that shaft, is somehow even stranger than the myth. For several days, I went down every rabbit hole I could find on this place, reading the old Soviet reports, the debunkings, the eyewitness interviews, and the geological papers. And I came out the other side with more questions than answers. This is the Kola Superdeep Borehole, and this is everything that came out of it. To understand why this hole terrifies people, you first have to understand just how insane the project was in the first place. The story begins in 1970, on the Kola Peninsula, a remote finger of Russian land that juts out into the Arctic, up near the border with Finland and Norway. It's cold, it's empty, and it's about as far from anywhere as you can get and still be in Europe. And it was here that the Soviet Union decided to attempt something that no country had ever seriously tried before. They were going to drill straight down into the earth as far as it was physically possible to go. Not to find oil, not to find minerals, just to see what was actually down there. Think about that for a second. We have sent people to the moon, which is nearly 400,000 kilometers away. We have flung probes past Pluto. We have photographed the edge of the observable universe. But the ground directly beneath your feet, the actual interior of our own planet, remains almost completely unknown to us. We have never seen the mantle. We have never touched the core. Everything we claim to know about the inside of the Earth is essentially an educated guess, pieced together from earthquakes and shockwaves and mathematical models. The Soviets wanted to stop guessing. They wanted to reach out and physically hold a piece of the deep Earth in their hands. The drill they built for this was called SG-3, and it was a monster. But here's the first thing that surprises most people. When they picture a hole this deep, they imagine some gaping black pit you could throw a car into. The reality is almost comically different. The Kola borehole is only about 23 centimeters wide. That's roughly 9 inches. You could not fit your shoulders down it. It's less a bottomless cavern and more like a needle, an impossibly long, thin needle pushed nearly 13 kilometers into solid rock. Hold that image in your mind, because it matters later. For years, the drilling went well. By 1979, Kola had already beaten the previous world record for the deepest hole. By 1983, they had reached 12 kilometers. The scientists were thrilled, papers were published, the Soviet Union had its bragging rights. And then, the deeper they went, the stranger the readings became. This is where the mystery actually begins. The first shock was the heat. Before drilling, scientists had carefully calculated how hot it should get down there. Their predictions said that at this depth, the temperature would be somewhere around 100 degrees Celsius. Manageable. Expected. Instead, when their instruments came back up, they were reading closer to 180 degrees Celsius. That is not a small miss. That is nearly double what the best minds in Soviet geology had predicted. And it meant that something about the way heat moves through the deep crust was fundamentally different from what everyone believed. At 180 degrees, water boils away instantly, electronics fry, and the entire environment turns hostile in a way the engineers had never planned for. But the heat wasn't even the strangest part. The strangest part was what the heat did to the rock. Down here, under enormous pressure and blistering temperature, the solid stone stopped behaving like solid stone. It began to flow. Not quickly, not like lava, but slowly, like extremely thick plastic or warm tar. Every time the drill bored through and pulled back, the walls of the hole would slowly ooze inward and try to close themselves back up, like the earth itself was trying to heal the wound. The borehole didn't want to stay open. It kept trying to seal itself. Sit with that image for a moment, because to a lot of people, that alone sounds less like geology and more like the planet reacting to being cut. Then came the water. Kilometers down, in fractured rock where there was no reason for any liquid to exist, the scientists found water. And not water that had simply trickled down from the surface over the centuries, because they checked, and it hadn't. This was water that appeared to have been squeezed directly out of the minerals themselves. The theory the researchers landed on was genuinely bizarre. They believed that the crushing heat and pressure had literally forced hydrogen and oxygen atoms out of the crystal structure of the rocks, and that those atoms had recombined into water and pooled in the cracks, sealed off from the world above for billions of years. Water, being born out of stone, in total darkness, deep inside the earth. It sounds like something out of a creation myth. It was one of the last things anyone expected to find. And I've saved the two biggest anomalies of this chapter for last. The first is what geologists call the missing boundary. Before drilling, seismic studies, the science of reading the earth by bouncing shockwaves through it, had predicted something very specific. At around 7 kilometers down, the drill was supposed to punch through the layer of granite that makes up the upper crust and cross into a completely different, denser layer of rock called basalt. Every model agreed on this. It was practically written in stone, no pun intended. So the team drilled down to 7 kilometers, fully expecting to hit that basalt layer, and it wasn't there. They kept drilling. Still granite. The clear, sharp boundary that all the seismic data had promised them simply did not exist as a change in rock type. The models had been confidently, completely wrong about the actual structure of the ground beneath them. Imagine spending your whole career trusting a map, drilling straight down through it, and discovering the map was describing a place that wasn't real. And then, the discovery that stops people cold. Deep down, several kilometers into the crust, in that ancient granite, the scientists found fossils. Microscopic fossils, the preserved remains of tiny, single-celled marine organisms, plankton, that had once floated in an ocean. 24 different species of them, by some accounts, perfectly preserved, encased in rock more than 2 billion years old, kilometers beneath a frozen Arctic peninsula, where no ocean has existed for an unimaginable span of time. Life. The ghost of life, anyway. Further underground than anyone thought life's traces could ever survive, having endured pressures and temperatures that should have erased them entirely. Now stack all of this up. A hole that tries to close itself. Heat nobody predicted. Water born from stone. A boundary that vanished. Fossils where fossils shouldn't be. And this is just the verified science, the boring, peer-reviewed textbook version of events. This is the part everyone agrees actually happened. So now imagine what people started to say happened when the Soviet Union, one of the most secretive governments on Earth, suddenly stopped drilling. Here is the story that made Kola famous. Not the fossils, not the water. This, according to the legend, as the drill pushed past the 12-kilometer mark, it broke through into something the scientists never expected. A vast, open cavern. A hollow space deep inside the Earth, where the models said there should only be solid rock. Curious, and increasingly nervous, the team is said to have lowered an extremely heat-resistant microphone down into that void, a special sensor designed to pick up the sounds of shifting rock and moving magma. What they heard instead, the story goes, was not geology. They heard screaming. Not one voice, not 100. According to the legend, the microphone picked up the sound of millions of human voices, all screaming at once, in what could only be described as agony. A chorus of the tormented, rising up out of the darkness from somewhere far below. The scientists, hardened Soviet engineers, atheists to a man in an officially atheist state, are said to have gone pale. Some of them recognized what they were hearing for what the legend insisted it was. They had drilled, by accident, straight into hell. And the story only escalates from there. Some versions claim that the terrified workers threw down their tools and abandoned the site on the spot, refusing to ever go back. Other versions add a detail even more chilling, that as the drilling broke through, a burst of luminous gas came screaming up out of the shaft, and out of that glowing cloud rose a creature. A gigantic, bat-winged figure, some accounts call it demonic, that unfurled itself over the rig before vanishing into the night sky, leaving behind Russian words burned into the clouds that translated to, "I have conquered." There are versions where hardened Soviet scientists, having heard the screams and seen the thing that came out, quietly converted to Christianity, unable to reconcile what they'd witnessed with the godless world they'd been raised to believe in. And of course, in every version, the crown jewel of the whole legend, the Soviet government, horrified by what its drill had uncovered, seized the recording, buried the evidence, sealed the hole, and ordered everyone involved to never speak of it again. For a long time, that recording circulated. You've probably heard it, even if you didn't know where it came from. A grainy, muffled loop of what sounds like countless voices wailing and howling in torment, supposedly the actual audio captured at the bottom of the Kola borehole. It spread across religious radio broadcasts, especially throughout the late 80s and 90s. It was played from pulpits. It was passed around on cassette tapes. It appeared in newspapers and, eventually, all over the early internet. To millions of people, this was hard proof. The Soviets had drilled too deep, and they had found the damned. And I want you to notice something about why this story worked so well. It didn't come from nowhere. It latched onto real, documented facts. The Soviets really were secretive. The hole really was the deepest ever drilled. The rock really did behave in strange ways. The project really did stop under circumstances that, to an outsider, looked abrupt. Every good lie needs a skeleton of truth to hang itself on, and the well to hell had plenty. So, when people heard that the scientists had found something down there, a part of them, maybe a part of you right now, thought, well, they did find water that shouldn't exist. They did find fossils that shouldn't be there. They did find a boundary that vanished. Who's to say they didn't find something worse? But if the screams were real, why did the Soviets stop drilling? That question, it turns out, has an answer. And it leads us straight into the second great theory of the Kola borehole. Not everyone who distrusts the official story believes in demons. There's a second camp, and their theory is, in some ways, more unsettling, because it doesn't require anything supernatural at all. It only requires you to believe that governments lie. And on that particular point, history tends to agree. To understand this theory, you have to remember when and where all of this was happening. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a total competition for supremacy, in space, in weapons, in science, in every arena where one could possibly humiliate the other. And drilling, believe it or not, was one of those arenas. Years earlier, the Americans had launched something called Project Mohole, an ambitious attempt to drill through the thin oceanic crust and reach the Earth's mantle. It failed, and it was quietly canceled. So, when the Soviets launched their own super deep drilling program and blew right past every record the Americans had ever set, the skeptics argue this was never really only about pure science. It was also about winning. It was a flex, carved 13 kilometers into the planet, designed to prove that Soviet technology could go places American technology couldn't. But if you accept that the geology was, at least in part, a matter of national prestige, a way to justify pouring enormous resources into a hole in the ground, then for some people, the obvious next question becomes darker. Was it a cover story for something else entirely? And this is where the theories multiply. Some believe Kola was never really a research station at all, but a testing ground for underground nuclear weapons, a way to study how the deep Earth would contain, or fail to contain, a detonation. Others argue it was a search for strategic minerals, rare and valuable resources buried far below the reach of any ordinary mine that the Soviet state wanted to secure in secret. There's a darker version still, one that claims the whole thing was research into geological warfare, into whether it might be possible to reach into the crust and deliberately trigger earthquakes on the other side of the world, a weapon with no visible launch and no obvious fingerprints. And then there's the theory that has a certain grim logic to it given the era, that the deep shafts and the surrounding complex were the beginnings of an underground bunker, a shelter for Soviet leadership to survive the nuclear war that everyone at the time genuinely believed was coming. None of these have any strong evidence behind them. Let me be clear about that. There's no smoking gun, no leaked document, no defector's confession that turns any of these theories into fact. The project, as far as the actual record shows, was openly scientific. But here's the thing the skeptics get right, the thing that keeps these ideas alive decades later. The Soviet Union absolutely did hide things exactly like this. It concealed nuclear disasters. It erased people from photographs. It ran secret cities that didn't appear on any map. So when someone points at a heavily guarded, extraordinarily expensive government hole in the most remote corner of the country and says, "I don't fully believe the official explanation," they aren't being crazy. They're being consistent with everything else that era taught us. Secrecy breeds suspicion, and Kola was born into an age drenched in it. So we have two theories. One says the Soviets found the supernatural and buried it. The other says the Soviets were hiding something strategic all along. Both are compelling. Both have that skeleton of truth holding them upright, and neither one, on its own, actually explains the full picture. Which means it's time to do the thing that most versions of this story never bother to do. It's time to bring in the skeptics, the geologists, and the people who actually worked there, and find out what really happened at the bottom of the deepest hole on Earth. Let's start with the screaming, because it's the load-bearing pillar of the entire legend, and it's also the easiest to knock down once you actually look at it. The story of the well to hell, in the form we know it, appears to trace back to around 1989, when it surfaced through a Finnish publication. From there it was picked up and amplified, especially by religious broadcasters in the United States, who played the recording and told the story to enormous audiences as though it were verified fact. The problem is that the details never held together. The most basic one, the legend almost always calls this the Siberian well to hell. But Kola isn't in Siberia. It's nowhere near Siberia. It's on the Kola Peninsula in the far northwest of Russia, more than 1,000 miles away. When a story can't even get the location of its own centerpiece right, that's usually a sign that the story was assembled by people who had never been anywhere near the actual place. Then there's the recording itself, that chilling loop of a million damned voices. When people finally analyzed it, they found it wasn't a mysterious artifact captured by a heat-resistant microphone at all. It appears to be an edited collage of sound effects, and portions of it have been traced back to Italian horror film called Barren Blood. In other words, the sounds of hell that were broadcast to millions of believers as proof of the afterlife were, at least in significant part, the manipulated soundtrack of an old vampire movie, slowed down, layered, and looped. The tortured screams of the damned were, quite literally, a movie prop. So why did the Soviets really stop drilling? Not because of demons, because of the plastic rock and the heat we talked about back in Chapter 1. Remember, at those depths, the temperature hit around 180 degrees Celsius, and the rock began to flow like putty, constantly trying to close the hole back up. Under those conditions, drilling becomes a nightmare. Equipment failed again and again. Sections of the drill string, the long assembly of pipe and bit, would get stuck or snap off and be lost in the depths, forcing the team to abandon that branch and start a new one at an angle. The deeper they went, the worse it got, and the slower and more expensive every additional meter became. And then the final blow arrived, and it had nothing to do with anything underground. The Soviet Union collapsed. The money vanished. A project that was already fighting physics itself suddenly had no funding to fight it with. That's why the drilling stopped. Not a scream, not a warning, a budget. And here's the detail that quietly demolishes the whole legend, the one almost nobody mentions. The story claims the Soviets heard the screams, and shut everything down in a panic. But the records show that drilling and scientific work at Kola continued into the post-Soviet period, into the 1990s. If they'd broken through into hell and fled in terror, why did they keep working there for years afterward? You don't calmly go back to your desk the morning after you've recorded the voices of the damned. The timeline of the real project and the timeline of the legend simply don't match. Now let's clean up the rest of the anomalies, because the skeptics have answers for those too, and the answers are genuinely fascinating in their own right. The water that shouldn't have been there? Real, and real strange, but not a hidden subterranean ocean, and not the doorway into a hollow earth, as some retellings claim, and certainly not the water supply of some lost underground civilization. It was exactly what the scientists said it was: water forced out of minerals by heat and pressure, trapped in fractured rock. Remarkable, unexpected, and it genuinely raised new questions about how fluids move through the deep crust, but explainable. The missing granite-basalt boundary? This one is a beautiful example of science correcting itself. The seismic boundary the models predicted was real, in the sense that the shock waves really did change behavior at that depth, but it didn't mark a switch from granite to basalt. It marked a zone where the granite itself had been so transformed by heat, pressure, fracturing, and that mineral-borne water that it started bouncing seismic waves differently. The lesson wasn't that the textbooks were deliberately lying, the way conspiracy versions insist. The lesson was subtler and more useful, that a change in seismic readings doesn't always correspond neatly to a change in the type of rock. The experiment didn't prove the model was a cover-up. It took an incomplete model and made it better. The fossils? Also real, also genuinely surprising, but not evidence of some living underground ecosystem or subterranean creatures, as the internet loves to claim. The microscopic organisms didn't live down there. Their remains were preserved in rock that had originally formed from ancient ocean sediments at the surface, and were then buried and pushed down and transformed over vast stretches of geological time. The shock wasn't that life thrives in the deep crust. The shock was that such delicate biological traces could survive being carried down and cooked under that much pressure and heat, and still be recognizable when they came back up. And the winged creature? The glowing cloud? The demon that flew out of the shaft with a message burning in the sky behind it? There are no contemporary project records of it, no named, identifiable witnesses, no verifiable photographs. This element doesn't even appear in the early versions of the story. It was bolted on later, as the tale got retold and retold, each storyteller adding a little more spectacle, until a fake audio clip had grown a full supernatural mythology around it, complete with a monster and a message. A fake sound report slowly evolved into a complete horror narrative, one retelling at a time. I'll add one more correction because it undoes something almost everyone gets wrong. Kola did not come anywhere close to the mantle, let alone the center of the Earth. 12 kilometers sounds enormous, and as a whole it absolutely is, but it represents only about 0.2% of the distance to the Earth's core. If the planet were an apple, the drill hadn't even broken the skin. There was no giant open cavern at the bottom to lower a microphone into, because the hole, remember, was barely 9 inches wide the entire way down, a narrow, branching industrial well, not a shaft a human being could ever climb down into. And those dramatic photos you've seen? The ones showing a vast, terrifying black pit yawning open in the earth? Those aren't Kola. They're unrelated open pit mines and sinkholes from elsewhere in the world, mislabeled and passed around online. The real Kola borehole, the actual deepest point mankind has ever reached, is marked today by a small, rusted metal cap you could stand on without even noticing. So that's it then. The screams are a horror movie. The stopping was a budget, the demon was invented, the pit is a photo of somewhere else. Case closed, mystery solved, nothing to see here. Except. I told you at the very beginning that once you strip away the lies, what's left is somehow stranger than the myth. So let's strip it all away, and let's look at what actually came out of that hole. Because this is the payoff. This is the part that genuinely shocked the people who were there, and it's the reason this place still matters long after the ghost stories have been debunked. Forget the demon, forget the screaming. Here is what the deepest hole in human history really pulled up out of the dark. It pulled up water that was never supposed to exist, born not from rain or rivers, but wrung out of solid stone by pressure so immense it tore the atoms of minerals apart and reassembled them into liquid, water that had been sealed in total blackness since before complex life existed on the surface of this planet. It pulled up the fossilized ghosts of living things, more than 20 species of ancient microscopic organisms, preserved in rock over 2 billion years old, kilometers beneath the frozen ground, having survived a journey down into the crushing heat of the crust that by every reasonable expectation should have obliterated them without a trace. Life, or the memory of it, further down than we ever believed the memory of life could reach. It pulled up proof that our maps of the inside of our own planet were wrong, that the neat layered diagram in every school book, granite here, basalt there, the one you probably drew in a science class as a kid, does not match what's actually beneath us. The Soviets drilled straight down into humanity's confident model of the Earth and discovered that the model was, in places, a guess dressed up as a fact. The boundary everyone promised was, there simply wasn't. We had to redraw the picture. And it pulled up something harder to name. Because think about what this hole actually is. It is the single deepest point that our entire species, in all its history, with all its technology, has ever managed to physically reach into the body of the planet we live on. Every human who has ever lived, every empire, every war, every discovery, all of it happened on a thin skin of rock, and the very deepest we have ever managed to pierce that skin is 12 kilometers, 0.2% of the way to the center. And even that tiny scratch nearly defeated us. The heat, the flowing rock, the collapsing walls, the lost drills, the Earth quietly trying to seal the wound behind us the entire time. We reached as far as we possibly could, and the planet still barely let us in, and then the world we built on the surface fell apart and we had to stop. That's the real shock of Kola. Not that we found hell, that we tried, as hard as we have ever tried at anything, to reach the inside of our own home, and we made it almost nowhere, and even that almost nowhere was full of things we couldn't explain and didn't predict. The screaming was fake, but the humility that hole should teach us is very, very real. And here's the last turn, the thing that keeps me up at night about this story. Some of the deepest questions Kola raised were never actually closed. Science explained the heat, the water, the fossils, the boundary, the audio hoax, but there are still oddities in the readings, still gaps in what we understand about how the deep crust behaves, because we have only ever sampled it in one place, through one impossibly thin needle, that one time, before we gave up. Everything we claim to know about 99.8% of the inside of the Earth is still, to this day, an inference, a shadow. A guess bounced off of earthquakes. We looked directly at the deep Earth exactly once, and it surprised us at nearly every level we checked. The Soviets sealed the borehole with a bolted metal cap. The research station was abandoned, the equipment stripped and scrapped, the buildings left to rot and collapse into the Arctic snow. To the conspiracy-minded, the ruin of the place looks like a cover-up, like a crime scene being erased. But the truth is quieter and somehow sadder than that. It simply ran out of money, like so many grand Soviet projects did when the country that dreamed them up ceased to exist. The greatest hole ever drilled into the Earth wasn't defeated by demons or shut down by a terrified government. It was defeated by physics, and then abandoned by history. So they welded it shut, and underneath that little rusted lid in the snow, the deepest wound humanity ever cut into the planet is still there, right now, as you watch this. Still blisteringly hot at the bottom. Still, ever so slowly, trying to close itself. Still holding water older than the first cell, and the fossils of things that died 2 billion years ago, and every question we never got to ask before the money ran out. We drilled deeper than we had ever gone. We found things we could not explain, and then we capped it, walked away, and told each other ghost stories about it instead of finishing the job. Maybe that's the most human thing in this entire story. The well to hell was never real, but the hole is. It's still down there, and we still don't really know what's underneath it.